The moment Eleanor opened the small wooden box, the scent of aged paper and faint lavender filled the air. It had been buried at the back of her mother's closet, tucked beneath a pile of winter blankets she hadn't touched in years. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She ran her fingers over the worn edges of the box before lifting the lid completely. Inside, a stack of neatly folded letters, bound with a faded red ribbon, rested carefully as if placed there with deliberate tenderness. Her hands trembled as she untied the ribbon, revealing the first letter on top. The ink had faded, the handwriting elegant but hurried, as though each word had been pressed onto the page with a desperate urgency. The date at the top, November 3rd, 1976, was decades old, written before Eleanor was even born. The realization struck her like a cold wind through an open window. These were her father's letters, the father she had never known. Eleanor had grown up on a diet of half-truths and omissions. Her mother, Margaret, was a woman of guarded emotions, a fortress that had always been impossible to breach. Whenever Eleanor asked about her father, the answers had been vague, detached. He was a good man. He had to leave. It's complicated. Those words had been enough when she was a child, but as she grew older, they became an ache, an emptiness that could not be ignored. Now, at 34, standing in her late mother's house, Eleanor finally held the truth in her hands. She unfolded the first letter carefully, the paper fragile beneath her fingertips. The words leaped out at her, raw and full of longing. "My dearest Margaret, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I have to write it anyway. Every day that passes without you feels like a lifetime. I replay our last conversation over and over again, trying to find the words I should have said, the words that could have changed everything. But I was a coward, wasn't I?" Eleanor exhaled sharply, gripping the letter tighter. The emotion in the words was palpable, thick with regret. She skimmed ahead, reading fragments of longing, apologies wrapped in poetry, confessions of a man haunted by his choices. Her mother had never spoken of love. Not once. The version of Margaret she had known was reserved, pragmatic, a woman who carried herself with a quiet strength but never revealed the burdens she bore. But these letters spoke of a love so consuming, so devastating, that it had to be hidden away, buried beneath blankets and time. She reached for another letter, flipping to a later date. December 21st, 1976. "Margaret, I saw you today. You didn't see me, but I watched you from across the street. You were carrying groceries, wearing that blue coat I loved so much. The wind was brutal, and you tucked your scarf tighter around your neck the way you always do when you're cold. It was like no time had passed at all. But of course, everything has changed. You don't need me anymore. Maybe you never did." Eleanor's stomach twisted. Had he been nearby all along? Had he watched them from a distance, choosing absence over presence? She dug deeper into the stack of letters, searching for answers, for an ending to the story that had been hidden from her all these years. The ink changed, growing more rushed, the letters growing shorter, as if hope had begun to dwindle. February 10th, 1977. "Margaret, I heard about the baby. Our baby. I don't know how to put into words what I felt when I found out. Joy? Terror? A crushing sadness that I wasn't there when you needed me most?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. He had known. He had known about her. A sharp pain bloomed in her chest as she flipped through the letters, searching for more, for anything that could explain why he hadn't been there. Her hands shook as she reached the last letter in the pile, dated years later, April 4th, 1982. "Margaret, this will be the last letter I write. I've accepted that you'll never respond. Maybe you never read them at all. I tell myself that's for the best. If you wanted me in your life, I would be there. But I wanted to say one last thing before I let go. I love you. I always have. And I love our daughter, even though she will never know me. Maybe that's the way it's meant to be. But if she ever asks, tell her this. I wanted to be there. I wanted to stay, but I wasn't strong enough." Eleanor pressed the letter against her chest, her vision blurring as the weight of the words settled deep within her. He had wanted to stay, but he hadn't. A heavy silence filled the room as she sat on the floor, surrounded by his words. the letters that told a story she had never been given. And suddenly, she wasn't just grieving her mother. She was grieving a man she had never known, a love that had been lost before she had ever taken her first breath. As the afternoon light faded through the window, Eleanor closed her eyes, her fingers tracing the fragile edges of the last letter. There was so much she still didn't understand. But one thing was certain. This story wasn't finished. She needed to find him. The rain started falling as Eleanor pulled onto the highway, the rhythmic patter against the windshield drowning out the thoughts swirling in her mind. The letters sat on the passenger seat, neatly stacked and bound again with the faded red ribbon, as if they too were holding their breath for what came next. She hadn't planned this trip, not in any real way. But the moment she had read the last letter, something in her had snapped. She couldn't stay in that house, couldn't sit with the weight of those words pressing down on her chest. She needed to move, to search, to find the man who had written those letters and disappeared into the past. But where did one begin looking for a ghost? Eleanor's mother had left little behind. No clues, no whispered confessions, no hidden documents revealing her father's identity. The letters had no return address, no mention of a place or a life beyond his words. The only detail she had was a name, James. That alone wasn't enough. But then she remembered the name of the town mentioned in one of the letters. I saw you today, from across the street. He had been close. And if he had been there once, maybe, just maybe, he had never gone far. She drove through the night, stopping only for coffee and gas, her fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. The town, Brookhaven, was small, a place she had only visited once or twice as a child. It was a quiet, unremarkable place, the kind of town where people stayed their whole lives, where strangers were noticed the moment they arrived. By dawn, she was there. Brookhaven was just as she remembered. Old brick storefronts lining the main street, a diner with its neon sign still flickering, a gas station where a single pump stood beside a rusting ice machine. A place frozen in time. Eleanor parked outside the diner, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes. This was as good a place as any to start. She stepped inside, the scent of coffee and frying bacon wrapping around her like a worn-out childhood memory. A few older men sat at the counter, nursing their coffees, watching the morning news with disinterest. The waitress, late 50s, hair tied back in a loose bun, looked up as Eleanor walked in, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to something closer to recognition. Eleanor hesitated. Had her mother been here before? Had she walked through this very door, sat at one of these booths, carrying the same burdens? She ordered coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street. She needed a plan, something more than just hoping to stumble into the truth. Her mother had spent years keeping this secret. People didn't hide things without a reason. Her eyes drifted to the stack of letters beside her, fingers tracing the edge of the top envelope. Maybe she was looking in the wrong direction. Instead of searching for him, maybe she needed to understand why he had left. What had driven him away? Eleanor unfolded the last letter again, rereading the words she had already memorized. If she ever asks, tell her this. I wanted to be there. I wanted to stay, but I wasn't strong enough. What had made him weak? Her thoughts were interrupted when the waitress returned with the coffee, pausing as she caught sight of the letters. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze lingering on the paper as if it carried a weight only she could see. Then, in a voice careful and measured, she asked, "Where'd you get those?" A chill crawled up Eleanor's spine. She looked up, meeting the woman's eyes. "They belong to my mother." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands tightening around the tray she carried. She didn't ask who Eleanor's mother was. She didn't need to. "I knew James." Her voice was quieter now, almost reverent. "I knew him well." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Is he here? In town?" The woman hesitated, and in that silence, Eleanor already knew the answer. "No," she said finally. "Not anymore." Disappointment sank deep into Eleanor's chest, but she refused to let it take hold completely. "Do you know where he went?" The woman exhaled slowly, setting the tray down on the table before sliding into the booth across from Eleanor. For the first time, Eleanor noticed the tired sadness in her eyes, the weight of years behind them. "He's gone," the woman said. And though the words were simple, they carried an unbearable finality. Passed away 15 years ago. Eleanor's breath caught. Gone. The words settled inside her, heavy and cold, like a door slamming shut before she could step through. She had come all this way, followed a trail of letters and longing, only to arrive too late. 15 years. He had been gone for 15 years. The waitress, her name tag read Miriam, watched her carefully, as if waiting to see how she would take the news. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Eleanor swallowed against the lump in her throat. "How did he die?" Miriam hesitated, glancing around the diner before lowering her voice. "Cancer," she said finally. "Lung cancer. He didn't have much time by the end." Eleanor stared down at her coffee, her hands wrapping tightly around the cup. She had spent her whole life wondering about this man, imagining different versions of him. A distant, uncaring father. A man who had walked away without looking back. But the man in those letters was not heartless. He had loved her mother. He had loved her. And now he was gone. Just another ghost she would never have the chance to know. A thought struck her, piercing through the grief. "Did he ever talk about us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miriam's expression softened. "All the time." Eleanor inhaled sharply, blinking against the burn in her eyes. "He used to sit right where you are now," Miriam continued. "Came in every morning, ordered the same thing, black coffee, toast. And every now and then, when he'd had a little too much to drink the night before, he'd start talking about Margaret, about the daughter he never got to know." She smiled sadly. "He loved you both. Regretted leaving until the day he died." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. "He left something," Miriam said after a moment. "For you." Eleanor's head snapped up. "What?" Miriam nodded. "A letter. He wrote it years before he passed. Told me that if you ever came looking for him, I should give it to you." Eleanor's breath hitched. A letter. A message from a man she had never met, waiting all these years, just in case. Miriam stood and disappeared behind the counter, returning a moment later with a small, yellowed envelope. She set it down on the table in front of Eleanor. Her name was written on the front in shaky, familiar handwriting. Eleanor stared at it, her heart pounding. This was it, the last letter. And inside, the final piece of the story. Eleanor sat frozen, staring at the envelope as though it might disappear if she looked away. Her name, written in faded ink, in the same handwriting that had filled the letters she had read the night before, felt heavier than anything she had ever held. This was her father's final message, waiting 15 years in a quiet diner for a daughter who might never come. Miriam watched her from across the table, a silent presence, patient and understanding. Eleanor forced herself to take a breath, steadying the tremor in her fingers as she picked up the envelope. The paper was brittle with age, the flap sealed but loosening at the edges. She slid her nail beneath it, careful not to tear the fragile contents within. A single sheet of paper lay inside, folded neatly. She unfolded it slowly, heart pounding, eyes scanning the words her father had left behind. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, then you came looking for me. I don't know if I deserve that, but I need you to know that I hoped for it. Every day, I hoped. I have spent a lifetime running from the things I couldn't face. Your mother deserved more than that. You did too. I have no excuses for my absence, only truths that I was too much of a coward to speak aloud. So I will write them now, even though it may be too late. I loved Margaret from the first moment I saw her. She was light in a world I had already grown too dark to belong in. She was strong, steady, everything I was not. And she loved me, though I never understood why. I think she believed I could be more than what I was. But the truth is, I was already lost before I ever met her. I had demons, Eleanor. Ones that whispered in the dark, ones that made a home in the hollow places of my heart. War does that to a man. It takes things from you that you can never get back. I came home a ghost, pretending to be a man. When your mother told me she was pregnant with you, I wanted to be happy. God, I wanted to be the kind of man who could look at that moment and feel nothing but joy. But all I felt was fear. Fear that I would ruin you the way I ruined myself. Fear that I would be the kind of father who left scars instead of love. So I ran. I told myself it was for the best, that you would be better off without me. But the truth is, I was just afraid. Afraid to stay, afraid to try, afraid to love something as deeply as I loved you both. And I have lived with that regret every single day since. I watched from a distance for as long as I could. I saw you grow, even if you never saw me. You were beautiful, strong, everything your mother was and more. I wanted to reach out so many times, but by then, I had made myself a stranger. I thought maybe it would be kinder if I stayed that way. I am sorry, Eleanor. More than I will ever be able to put into words. If I could take back every lost moment, every birthday missed, every night you wondered why I wasn't there, I would. But I can't. All I can do is leave you these words and hope they mean something. I loved you. I love you still. And wherever I am now, I hope you know that I have carried you with me always. James. Eleanor's hands trembled as she finished reading, tears slipping down her cheeks unchecked. The diner around her blurred, the quiet hum of conversation and clinking coffee cups fading into the background. Her father had been right there, watching, waiting, hoping, and she had never known. She thought of all the moments she had spent hating him, hating the absence, the silence, the emptiness he had left behind. She had convinced herself that he had never cared, that he had abandoned her without a second thought. But the truth was more complicated, more painful. He had been broken, and instead of trying to heal, he had chosen to disappear. Not because he didn't love her, but because he thought she was better off without him. And in the end, he had regretted it. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. Miriam reached across the table, resting a hand gently over Eleanor's. "He talked about you all the time," she said softly. "He kept a picture of you. One your mother must have sent him, back when you were still little. He never let go of it." Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Where is he buried?" Miriam hesitated. "Outside of town, near the old church. No family left to bury him properly. He didn't leave much behind." Eleanor nodded, her decision already made. She needed to go. The cemetery was small, nestled between a grove of trees that swayed in the late afternoon breeze. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light across the rows of headstones. It was quiet, peaceful. Eleanor walked slowly, the letter still clutched tightly in her hand, her footsteps crunching over fallen leaves. Miriam had given her directions, and she found the grave easily. It was simple, unadorned, no flowers, no signs of visitors. Just a single stone, weathered by time. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, staring at the name that had once been nothing more than an absence in her life. Now, he was real, tangible, a man with flaws and fears, regrets and love. She knelt slowly, pressing her palm against the cool stone. "I found you," she whispered, though the words felt strange without a voice to hear them. She didn't know what she had expected to feel. Closure, maybe. But grief didn't work that way. It wasn't neat or simple. It lingered, tangled itself around the heart, refusing to be unraveled in a single moment. But there was something else, too. Something lighter. She wasn't lost anymore. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the stack of letters, untying the faded red ribbon one last time. One by one, she placed them beside the headstone, letting the wind catch the edges, rustling the paper like whispers. He had spent years writing to someone who would never read his words. Now, at last, they were where they belonged. As she stood, the wind carried the last of the autumn leaves across the graveyard, stirring the letters gently before settling again. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt whole. Eleanor lingered at the grave for what felt like hours, her fingertips brushing over the edges of the letters she had placed beside the headstone. The wind had settled, the world hushed in the fading light of evening. She had spent her entire life carrying the weight of her father's absence, and now, standing here, she wasn't sure what came next. Grief was a strange thing. It didn't vanish with answers. It didn't disappear the moment a mystery was solved. But there was something different now, an understanding she hadn't had before. Her father had been many things, broken, scared, regretful, but he had loved her. And even if she had never known him, that love had existed. That had to be enough. She took one last breath and turned away from the grave, walking back toward the car parked along the dirt road. The sun had dipped below the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground, and the cool evening air sent a shiver through her. She had come here looking for a man. She had found a story. Now, she had to figure out what to do with it. Miriam was still at the diner when Eleanor returned. The place had emptied out for the night, save for a lone man at the counter sipping his coffee, the neon sign in the window buzzing softly against the quiet. The older woman looked up as Eleanor walked in, setting down the dish she had been wiping clean. Eleanor slid into the same booth she had occupied that morning, exhaustion settling into her bones. "Well?" Miriam asked gently, sitting across from her again. Eleanor exhaled. "I left the letters with him." Miriam nodded, a soft smile touching the corners of her lips. "I think he'd like that." They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken weight of everything passing between them. "I wish I had known him," Eleanor admitted finally. Miriam reached across the table again, squeezing her hand briefly. "In a way, you do. Maybe not in the way you wanted, but you know the part of him that mattered." Eleanor nodded slowly. It wasn't the same as having him in her life, but it was something. A thought stirred in her mind, something unfinished, a thread she hadn't yet pulled. "Did my mother ever know," she asked, "that he was still watching us?" Miriam hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns against the worn tabletop. "I don't know for sure," she admitted. "Margaret never came back here. If she ever suspected he was nearby, she never said a word." Eleanor thought about that, trying to imagine her mother knowing that her father had been close. Would she have reached out? Or had she shut that door long ago, refusing to open it again? It was a question that would never have an answer. But Eleanor wasn't angry. Not anymore. For years, she had resented her mother for keeping her father a secret. Now, she understood why. Margaret had been trying to protect her, to make sure she didn't grow up waiting for a man who was too afraid to stay. Maybe, in her own way, she had been trying to protect herself, too. And maybe neither of them had been entirely right, or entirely wrong. The next morning, Eleanor packed her things and checked out of the small motel on the edge of town. The air was crisp, the sky a soft gray, the promise of autumn settling deeper into the trees. She stood beside her car for a moment, looking out over the quiet streets of Brookhaven. She had come here chasing a ghost. She was leaving with a story. It wasn't the ending she had expected, but it was the one she had. Before she got into the car, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the last letter. Her father's final words to her. She had read it so many times now that the paper felt worn, the creases deep. Slowly, she unfolded it again, reading the words one last time. "I love you still, and wherever I am now, I hope you know that I have carried you with me always." She smiled softly, tucking the letter back into her pocket. Maybe that was the real truth. Love, even in its absence, had never really left. With one last look at the town that had held so many secrets, Eleanor opened the car door and slid inside, starting the engine. It was time to go home, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she finally knew where that was.